There are places in the world where death is not an ending, where the boundary between the living and whatever lies beyond grows so thin that something patient, something furious, something that refused every grave ever dug for it, can push through. The wizarding world had such a place, a stone archway in a sunken chamber beneath the Ministry of Magic, draped with a veil that whispered in voices no living person could quite understand. Scholars had debated its nature for centuries, but philosophers had written volumes. Children had died reaching for it out of pure, terrible curiosity. Lord Voldemort had not chosen the veil. The veil had chosen him. When the final curse rebounded at Hogwarts, when his own killing curse, cast in desperation and fury, struck the boy who should have been nothing, should have been dead, the magical shockwave that tore through the castle did not dissipate into the air like smoke. It traveled. It bent reality the way only the darkest, most concentrated magic could, and it found the veil still standing in its ruined chamber, still breathing, still waiting. The shockwave struck it like a hammer, and the veil tore sideways, not into death, not into the nothing that Voldemort had spent his entire life fleeing. It tore into elsewhere, into a cold so absolute and ancient it predated language, into a silence so complete it felt less like quiet and more like the world holding its breath. Into snow he did not fall. The Lord Voldemort did not fall. He arrived, thin and white and terrible, materializing from the tear, in reality the way a blade materializes from a sheath, with purpose and with edge, and he stood in the snow beyond the wall, and he breathed. The air burned his throat. It was clean in a way that felt hostile, the way true wilderness is always hostile to those who have spent their lives in constructed things. There were no buildings here, no roads, no lights on any horizon. There was only the dark, and the snow and the impossibly massive structure of ice rising to his south like a god had built a wall to separate the world from whatever lived up here. His wand was gone. He registered this the way a soldier registers a lost weapon in the field, with cold fury, immediate cataloging, and the absolute refusal to consider it a fatal problem. He had performed wandless magic before. He had bent reality to his will with nothing but his mind and the power that had always lived inside him like a furnace. A wand was a conductor. He was the source. He raised one pale hand and sent a burst of silent force into the nearest snowdrift. It exploded 20 feet into the air. He watched the snow hang there, suspended for one crystalline moment, then fall. Good. His power had survived the transit. Whatever this place was, wherever the veil had thrown him, the fundamental laws that governed his magic still applied. He was whole. He was conscious. He was, infuriatingly, wandless. But he was alive, which was the only thing that had ever mattered. He turned slowly, red eyes scanning the tree line, reading the land the way he had always read everything, as a system of threats and resources. And then he felt it. Magic. Not his magic. Not the clean, structured, but deliberate magic of the wizarding world. This was something older and stranger. A pulse beneath the earth like a second heartbeat, wild and uncontrolled, running through the roots of trees and the bones of the frozen ground. It reminded him faintly and distastefully of the magic that ran through places like Hogwarts itself. Ambient, accumulated, ancient. But where Hogwarts had been shaped over 1,000 years of habitation by magical people, this felt unshaped, raw, like a river that had never been dammed or diverted, like power that had never once been taught what it was. Primitive. The word arrived in his mind with the faint curl of something that was not quite contempt and not quite interest. Both, perhaps. In the wizarding world, a magic user of this wild, untrained variety would have been considered a squib at worst, an undisciplined child at best. But even undisciplined fire could be studied, could be understood, could be used. He began to walk south. He found the first one 3 days later. The man wore red robes that had gone gray with ash and travel, and he was kneeling in the snow beside a makeshift altar, burning something that smelled of copper and salt and old sacrifice. He was praying, in a language Voldemort did not recognize, to a god called Reller, the Lord of Light, a deity of fire and prophecy, whose followers Voldemort had already gathered from watching 2 villages from the shadows. They were the closest thing this world had to magic users, not wizards, not even practitioners, really. They were more like conduits, vessels, people through whom power moved without their ever fully understanding its mechanics. He watched the Red Priest for a long time. The man's name was Thoros, or had been once before hunger and displacement had stripped him down to something leaner and more desperate. He had been part of a brotherhood. The brotherhood was gone. He had been part of a war. The war had moved past him. He knelt in the snow and prayed to his god and hoped his god was listening. Voldemort stepped out of the tree line. The Red Priest heard the footsteps and turned, and whatever he saw in the pale man's red eyes made him reach immediately for something that was not a weapon. A piece of carved wood, bound in leather, marked with symbols that meant nothing to Voldemort and everything to this world's idea of holy protection. Voldemort looked at it. Then he looked at Thoros, Legilimens. He did not say the word. He did not need to. He had not needed words for legilimency in 20 years. He simply entered, sliding into the Red Priest's mind, the way a key enters a lock that was never meant to have one. And he read. He read for a long time. What he found was extraordinary. This world had resurrection, crude, costly, dependent on a god whose attention was inconsistent but real. The Lord of Light's followers could bring back the dead. They had done it multiple times. Voldemort stood in the snow and processed this information with the particular intensity of a man who had spent his entire life building elaborate architecture around the avoidance of death. And he recognized immediately that this single fact changed every calculation he had. He had built Horcruxes, 7 of them, anchors in reality, tethers between his soul and the living world, ensuring that no matter what killed his body, some fragment of him would always persist, always find its way back. It was genius. It was also, he now understood, inefficient. The Horcruxes had required objects. Objects could be found. Objects could be destroyed. He had lost all 7 of them. He had died, genuinely, finally, completely, because a boy with a scar had dismantled his anchors one by one. He would not make that mistake again. He withdrew from Thoros's mind and let the man collapse gasping into the snow. Voldemort crouched beside him, unhurried, the way a man is unhurried when he has already decided the outcome of a situation. And he considered what he had seen. Blood magic. The Lord of Light's resurrection ran on blood and fire and sacrifice. It was powered by belief, yes, but beneath the belief was a genuine energetic exchange. Life for life, power for power. The mechanics were sloppy and the theology was nonsense, but the underlying principle was sound. And Voldemort had always been very good at taking a sound principle and refining it into something no one had ever imagined possible. He looked at his own hand, pale, wandless, whole. If resurrection in this world was possible, if he could learn its mechanics and rewrite them, then a Horcrux did not need to be an object. It needed to be something alive, something that walked and breathed and bled. Something integrated so deeply into this world's social fabric that destroying it would be unthinkable. something that carried his soul fragment so seamlessly that neither the host nor any observer would ever suspect what lived inside them. The great houses of this world. He had seen them in Thoris's mind. The Lannisters, the Starks, the Targaryens, the Baratheons. Ancient bloodlines. Powerful names. The pillars around which this world's entire political order was constructed. What if the pillars were his? He began to work that night with Thoris's half-conscious cooperation and the borrowed mechanics of the Lord of Light's blood rites, stripped of every theological element and rebuilt from the foundation as pure, dark, deliberate enchantment. It took 7 hours. It cost him more wandless effort than anything he had performed since his resurrection in the graveyard years ago. But when the sun rose cold and white over the frozen north, the Lord Voldemort stood and flexed his fingers and felt somewhere in the vast network of this strange world's noble houses, the faint, distant pulse of something that was him. A Lannister child in King's Landing had begun dreaming in a language she did not recognize. A Stark boy in the crypts of Winterfell had pressed his hand against the stone of his ancestor's tomb and whispered, without knowing why, in the tongue of serpents. The Game of Thrones had just acquired a new player. The difference was, this player did not want the throne. He wanted the players. If you want to see more of history's greatest villains collide with the world's most beloved universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see next in the comments below. The Dark Lord has only just arrived, and Westeros will never be the same. The Night King had existed for 8,000 years. He did not think the way living men thought, in words, in plans, in the fragile linear narratives that mortals constructed to make sense of their brief, flickering lives. He thought in cold, in weight, in the slow, grinding certainty of a glacier that has decided to move and cannot be reasoned with or redirected. He thought in the language of inevitability. Winter was not a season to him, it was a verdict, and he had been delivering it, patiently, methodically, for longer than most of the civilizations south of the Wall had existed. He had never retreated, he had never had reason to. The dead obeyed him, the living feared him. The Wall, that monument of ice and ancient magic, raised by a man who had understood what was coming with a clarity no one since had matched, had held him back for centuries, but it had always been a delay, never a denial. He was patient in the way that only things outside of time can be patient. The Wall would fall, the living would scatter, the world would grow cold and silent and his, and then something tore through the fabric of the world north of his domain, and the Night King felt it, not with eyes, not with the pale, ancient intelligence behind his blue gaze. He felt it the way he felt everything, through the dead, through the vast, whispering network of whites and White Walkers spread across the frozen wilderness, connected to him like nerves to a brain. The disturbance moved through them like a tremor moves through the earth, subtle at first, then undeniable. Something had arrived in his territory that did not belong to death and did not belong to life, and was not afraid of either. He turned his gaze north, and for the first time in 8,000 years, the Night King was curious. Voldemort felt the White Walkers before he saw them. He had been moving south for 4 days, following the Wall's eastern edge and cataloging this world's magical signatures, the way a scholar catalogs a new species, with detached fascination and the constant underlying question of how can this be used. The ambient magic of the land had begun to feel less foreign to him. He was learning its rhythms, the way it pooled in certain places, near ancient trees with red eyes carved into their bark, near standing stones older than any kingdom this world remembered, near the places where something had bled into the earth. So long ago the blood had become geology. He was building a map in his mind, not a geographical one, a metaphysical one. He was so absorbed in this work that he almost missed the cold, not the ordinary cold of beyond the wall winter. Something else, something directed, a cold with intention behind it, moving through the tree line toward him from three sides simultaneously with the patient. A methodical coordination of a military operation carried out by soldiers who had been running military operations since before humanity had invented the word soldier. He stopped walking. He stood very still in the snow and he listened. 11 of them. He could feel them. Feel was not quite the right word, but it was the closest available. In the same way he could feel the magic that animated them. Dark magic. Necromantic magic. Powerful in its scope in a way that genuinely surprised him, because scope was the one thing he had not expected from what Thoros's memories had described as mindless, soulless, dead things. These were not mindless. These were not soulless. They were something else entirely. They were death-given purpose, and the intelligence behind that purpose was very old and very cold, and currently regarding him from approximately 40 yards away through the trees. A white walker stepped into the clearing. Voldemort looked at it. It looked at him. He had faced Dumbledore. He had faced the Elder Wand turned against him by its true master. He had faced a boy walking calmly to his own death and somehow winning. He was not, in any meaningful sense of the word, capable of being frightened by a tall man with blue eyes and an ice spear. He raised one hand. The walker hurled the ice spear with a speed that would have been invisible to a normal human eye. Voldemort caught it, not physically. His hand didn't move. He stopped it in the air 3 inches from his chest with a burst of wandless force so concentrated it shattered the ice construction on contact, sending fragments spinning into the snow. He looked at the crystal shards for a moment. Then he looked back at the walker. Interesting, he thought. Ice spears. Primitive. He sent the walker flying backward into the tree line with a casual, almost contemptuous gesture, and then the rest of them came. There were 11 white walkers, and Voldemort had no wand. It was, he would reflect later, one of the more genuinely demanding fights of his considerable career. They were fast, faster than anything that size had any right to be, and they moved with a fluid, inhuman coordination that suggested shared consciousness. They did not telegraph their attacks. They did not hesitate or reconsider or experience anything resembling self-preservation instinct. They simply came, cold and implacable and utterly without fear, and the ice they generated was not merely a weapon but an environment. Frost spreading across the ground with each step, the temperature dropping with each passing second in a radius around them that was designed, he realized, to slow, to freeze, to turn a living enemy into something cooperative. He refused to cooperate. He moved through them with wandless magic that cost him enormously in concentration and effort, blasting ice constructs apart before they could close, throwing walkers into each other with directed force, burning the frost off his own skin with controlled bursts of heat that left him slightly more exhausted each time. He could not conjure fire the way he could with a wand. Not here, not yet. But he could do something close enough. Sustained kinetic energy converted to heat at the point of contact. And the walkers did not like it. Where ordinary fire might not have been sufficient, the particular character of his magic, dark, yes, but willed in a way that pure elemental force was not, disrupted the enchantment, sustaining them in ways ice did not expect. 3 of them shattered. The remaining 8 pulled back, and then the air pressure changed. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 4 seconds. The trees at the clearing's edge cracked and splintered from the sudden cold. The snow stopped falling and hung suspended, and the Night King walked into the clearing from the north. like winter itself had decided to take humanoid form and pay a visit. They regarded each other across 20 feet of frozen ground. Voldemort had not been able to read Thoros's memories fully enough to prepare him for this. The images had been there, tall, ancient, silent, crowned in ice. But the reality of the thing was different from the memory of it, the way a photograph is different from a fire. The Night King carried with him a gravity that was almost physical, an age, a certainty. He was not threatening Voldemort with violence. He was threatening him with the simple, categorical fact of what he was, which was the end of all things, arrived in advance of its schedule. The Night King raised one hand. Across the clearing, every piece of shattered walker began to reassemble. Frost crept back across the ground, the wights in the tree line. Hundreds of them, Voldemort now realized, had been standing in the darkness this entire time, perfectly still, waiting for a signal that had not come until now, shifted with a sound like 10,000 dry leaves disturbed by the same wind. Voldemort felt, for the first time in this encounter, the specific quality of attention that required a response beyond force. He reached into the earth. He did not do it with words or wand movements. He did it with raw will, pressing his consciousness down through the snow and soil to the pulse of ambient magic. He had spent 4 days learning to read, and he grabbed it. Grabbed it the way you grab a river, badly, straining, losing as much as he caught. And he forced it up through the ground and shaped it. The earth beneath the Night King's feet detonated upward in a geyser of dark enchanted soil and ancient magic that blasted the clearing apart, sending snow and ice and wood and stone 40 feet in every direction. It was not an explosion. It was more fundamental than that. It was the land itself briefly, violently refusing the Night King's presence, channeled through the will of a man who had spent his life bending the world to his intentions. When the debris settled, the Night King was gone. Not destroyed. Voldemort had no illusions about that. The earth pulse had cost him more than he was comfortable acknowledging, and he had felt the Night King's power resist it, the way a glacier resists a hammer, absorbing, displacing, reforming. But he was gone from the clearing. The wights had retreated. The temperature was already climbing back toward merely brutal. Voldemort stood alone in the ruined clearing and breathed carefully and took stock. The Night King would return, more organized, with greater numbers, with whatever strategic intelligence drove that ancient, patient mind applied specifically to the problem of a wandless dark wizard who disrupted necromantic magic in ways the dead king had apparently not encountered before. This territory was no longer safe, and staying north of the wall was tactically indefensible, without resources, allies, or at minimum a wand. He needed to move south. But there was something else, something that had happened in the fight that he was still processing, when he had grabbed the ambient magic and shaped it, when he had forced it through his will and thrown it at the Night King. He had felt the soul fragments he had placed in the noble houses respond, faintly, distantly, like tuning forks struck by a sound too low for ordinary ears. The living Horcruxes had resonated with what he'd done, as if his use of this world's magic had somehow deepened the connection. As if every time he drew on the power of this land, he became more integrated into it, and so did the fragments of his soul, embedded in its ruling families. The implications of this were significant enough that he stood still for almost a full minute processing them. Then he turned south, toward the wall, toward the kingdoms beyond it, toward the distant pulse of his living Horcruxes, going about their days in castles and keeps and throne rooms, completely unaware that they were no longer entirely their own. And he walked. The Night King stood on a ridge 3 miles north and watched him go. For the first time in 8,000 years, the Night King changed his march. The army of the dead shifted east, not in retreat. The Night King did not retreat, but in redirection, a detour. An acknowledgement that the equation had changed, and the variable responsible for changing it needed to be evaluated more carefully before it was engaged again. The living, watching from the wall's battlements, saw the dead army shift direction in the pre-dawn darkness and told each other it was a miracle, a sign from the gods, some unexplained mercy from forces beyond their understanding. They were right about the forces being beyond their understanding. They were catastrophically wrong about the mercy. King's Landing smelled of ambition and rot. Voldemort had crossed the wall through a gate whose Night's Watch guards had looked at him once and then looked away. Compelled by a wordless suggestion planted so smoothly, they would each spend the rest of their short lives believing the decision had been entirely their own. He had moved south through the Gift, through the small scattered villages and frozen holdfasts, learning as he walked. He learned the way he had always learned, by taking. By observing and extracting and cataloging, he read the minds of travelers on the King's Road. He listened to the conversations of innkeepers and merchants and wandering septons. He absorbed the political geography of this world with the focused hunger of a man who understood. That information was the most durable weapon ever forged. By the time the capital's walls appeared on the horizon, shimmering in the gray winter light above the mouth of the Blackwater, he knew the name of every major house. He knew the structure of the small council. He knew that a woman called Cersei Lannister sat the Iron Throne by virtue of surviving everyone who had ever threatened her, and that she was brilliant and paranoid, and burning slowly from the inside with a grief she had converted, as such people always do, into cruelty. He knew that a Targaryen queen was somewhere in the west, with dragons and an army and the kind of righteous fury that made people do enormously stupid things. He knew that the dead were coming, and he knew, with the particular clarity of a man who had built his entire existence on the single principle that death was the enemy and power was the answer, exactly how to position himself between the two. He did not approach King's Landing through the gates. He walked through the front gate. Alone, in broad daylight, past 200 gold cloaks who saw him and felt each one the sudden and absolute certainty that they had personally authorized this pale man's entry and would stake their professional reputation on it. The Red Keep had excellent bones. Voldemort moved through it in the hours before dawn, learning its architecture the way he had once learned Hogwarts, not as a building but as a system, where the power pooled, where the sightlines overlapped. Where a man who understood the invisible architecture of enchantment could place something permanent and difficult to find. He spent 3 hours warding corridors and staircases and the deep stone of the walls themselves, layering compulsion enchantments so subtle they would read as nothing more than a vague unwillingness to enter certain rooms, a faint discomfort that most people would attribute to drafts or superstition or the ordinary unease of old stone places at night. By the time the keep's inhabitants began to stir with the early morning, it was already his in every way that mattered. Cersei Lannister's solar was on the 3rd level of the Maegor's holdfast. She was already awake when he knocked, something her guards would never adequately explain afterward, since they had no memory of letting him pass. And the woman who opened the door was exactly what he had assembled from a dozen extracted memories. Beautiful, guarded, they're wearing her composure the way soldiers wear armor, with the particular practiced ease of someone who had been wearing it so long they'd forgotten it wasn't skin. She looked at him. He looked at her. "You are not afraid," he said. It was not a compliment. It was data. "I've met monsters before," Cersei said. Her hand was moving towards something at her hip, a knife, small, practical, the kind of weapon a queen keeps, because trusting others to protect you is a luxury she had correctly identified as suicidal. They all thought I should be afraid of them too. And were you? A pause. Fractional. No. Voldemort considered her for a long moment. In his experience, extensive, definitive, there were two kinds of people who did not fear him on first contact. Those who were too foolish to recognize what they were facing, and those who were afraid of something else more. Cersei Lannister was not foolish, which meant something frightened her beyond anything he visibly represented. He reached into her mind, gently, barely a touch, the lightest possible application of legitimacy, and found it immediately. Her children, the ones she had lost, the ones she hadn't yet. He withdrew before she felt him, which was before she would have reached for the knife. He filed the information away with the careful precision of a man who never wastes good intelligence. "I'm not here for your throne," he said. Something shifted in her eyes. Not relief. She was too intelligent for relief. Recalculation. "Then what do you want?" "The same thing you want," he said. "To survive what's coming." He told her about the dead army. He told her with the flat, precise, unemotional language of a general briefing a subordinate, because that was the register she would respect, and the one least likely to trigger her considerable defensive instincts. He told her the Night King had turned his march. He told her that the living kingdoms had approximately one season before the dead reached them in force that no conventional army could withstand. He told her that he could change this. He did not tell her the rest. He did not tell her that 2 months ago, in a cold enchantment ritual north of the wall, he had placed a fragment of his soul inside her youngest surviving son. He did not tell her that the fragment was dormant, sleeping, settled into Tommen's psyche like a seed into soil, changing nothing yet, waiting. He did not tell her that the slight headaches Tommen had been experiencing, the occasional strange dreams, the one morning 3 weeks ago when he had opened his mouth to speak and something other than words had almost come out, that all of this was him, settling in. He offered her an alliance instead. She accepted it in the way powerful. Pragmatic people accept arrangements they distrust, but cannot afford to decline, with her eyes doing most of the evaluation, while her face showed her nothing at all. The ravens stopped working on a Tuesday. They stopped mid-flight, dozens of them simultaneously, across the breadth of King's Landing, and hung in the air for 3 full seconds before resuming their trajectories, and every message they carried arrived at its destination slightly altered. Not the words. The words were the same, but the urgency behind them, the sense of priority, the weight given to certain sentences over others, all subtly, invisibly adjusted. The Grand Maester noticed that his responses to correspondence had begun to feel slightly unlike himself, without being able to identify the specific quality of their difference. The captain of the Gold Cloaks found himself making patrol route decisions that felt entirely intuitive and could not have explained them under questioning. The women who managed the castle's servant rotation began unconsciously keeping certain corridors clear at certain hours with no memory of being asked to do so. The Red Keep was breathing differently. In the War Council chambers, Voldemort sat at Cersei's left hand and said very little. He did not need to say very much. He had already done the primary work, the compulsions, the adjustments, the careful and invisible restructuring of the castle's information flow, and what remained was performance. The appearance of a counselor, an advisor, a strange pale man of unknown origin who had arrived with knowledge of the coming threat and the peculiar, unsettling habit of always knowing what someone was about to say before they said it. Qyburn watched him with the focused attention of a man who recognized a fellow practitioner of things other people found distasteful. Their working relationship, when it developed, was the most honest relationship Voldemort formed in King's Landing. Two men who had each discarded conventional morality as an obstacle and found each other across the table with the wary mutual recognition of professionals. It was Qyburn who brought him the first news of the dragons. The word dragon had appeared in Thoros's memories, in many people's memories actually, but theory and reality maintained their eternal distinction. Voldemort stood on the walls of the Red Keep in the early evening and watched Daenerys Targaryens approach from the west, the three dragons riding thermals above her Dothraki advance, with the casual, enormous confidence of creatures that had never once in their lives encountered something they couldn't burn, and he felt something he identified, after brief examination, as genuine interest. Dragons were magical creatures, deeply, constitutionally, thoroughly magical, not in the way wizarding world creatures were magical, as incidental features of their biology, but structurally, fundamentally. The fire they breathed was not chemical combustion, it was transmutation. It was the conversion of ambient magical energy into directed heat through a biological process so refined by millennia of evolution that the dragons themselves had no more conscious awareness of performing it than a human has of circulating blood. They were in the most literal sense, living magical reactors. He watched Drogon, the largest, the black one, the one the Targaryen queen rode, bank west in the fading light, and he understood immediately what he was looking at. The most powerful vessel in this world. Not for riding, not for war, for anchoring. A living Horcrux in a dragon would not be like a living Horcrux in a child. A child could be killed. A child was vulnerable to any blade, any poison, any of the 1,000 ordinary and extraordinary ways that lives ended in this world. But a dragon was a fortress. A dragon was armored and enormous and capable of incinerating conventional threats from altitude. A dragon in this world was treated culturally as something close to a god. People did not attack dragons. People did not try to attack dragons. The psychological barrier alone was almost as protective as the physical one. And more than all of this, a dragon's magic was resonant. He had felt it from the walls, even at this distance, a harmonic frequency that interacted with his own power in ways that were still unclear but unmistakably real. A soul fragment anchored in that resonant field would not merely persist. It would amplify. It would integrate with the dragon's magic and become something new, something that had never existed before in either world he had inhabited. He began to plan. The Targaryen queen wanted to discuss terms. She sent a rider the following morning, politely worded, firm in its underlying demand for acknowledgement of her claim, the kind of diplomatic language that was really just a velvet rendering of submit or burn. Cersei, predictably, wanted to refuse. Voldemort advised against refusal. He advised a meeting. He advised it with enough quiet certainty that Cersei agreed, before fully understanding why, and spent the next hour slightly irritated with herself about it. The meeting was arranged for 3 days hence, on neutral ground outside the city's walls. Voldemort spent those 3 days preparing something that had no precedent in the history of either world. A ritual drawn from the mechanics of Horcrux creation, restructured to function without a wand, adapted to interface with draconic magical resonance, powered by the accumulation of this world's ambient energy he had been absorbing for weeks, like a battery charging. On the morning of the meeting, he stood in his chambers in the Red Keep and felt the distant pulse of his living Horcruxes. The Lannister child, the Stark boy, 3 others he had placed quietly in the weeks since his arrival, and he added to his internal map a new marker. One more, he thought. One more and it will be enough. Outside, the dragons were already circling. The neutral ground chosen for the meeting was a stretch of windswept field 3 miles south of King's Landing, flat and open in the way that places chosen for diplomatic encounters always are, so that no one could hide an army in it without everyone seeing the army. It was the kind of location that communicated architecturally that both parties had agreed to pretend they trusted each other for the duration of the conversation. Daenerys Targaryen arrived on Dragonback. She landed Drogon 70 yards from the Lannister banners with the particular theatrical confidence of a woman who had learned that entrance was half of negotiation, and she walked across the frost-hardened grass with her silver hair catching the gray winter light and her eyes doing what they always did. Evaluating, measuring, deciding. She had brought Tyrion, who walked at her left shoulder with the expression of a man performing several complex calculations simultaneously and hoping none of them resolved into catastrophe. She had brought Jon Snow, who had arrived from the north 3 days prior, with news of the dead army and the expression of a man who had stopped being surprised by impossible things but had not yet stopped being exhausted by them. She had not brought the other dragons. Rhaegal and Viserion were circling to the north, invisible as dark shapes against the cloud cover, present enough to remind everyone present what the consequences of bad faith would look like from the inside. Voldemort stood at Cersei's left hand and watched Daenerys cross the field and thought, "She is exactly what I calculated her to be. Righteous, determined, powered by a conviction so total it had become indistinguishable from identity. She believed in her cause the way the Red Priests believed in their god, not as a position, but as a fact. This was both her greatest strength and the precise mechanism he intended to use against her. The meeting opened with the formalities that such meetings always opened with. Tyrion spoke. Cersei's representative spoke. Jon Snow said something direct and tactically irrelevant about the dead army that everyone already knew, with the earnest delivery of a man who still believed that if you simply told people the truth clearly enough, they would respond to it rationally. Voldemort said nothing. He stood and he watched, and he moved through the edges of every mind present with the lightest possible touch. Not reading, not compelling, just orienting, learning the shape of each person's attention, where it pointed, what it avoided. It was during Tyrion's third attempt to find common diplomatic ground that Daenerys looked directly at Voldemort for the first time. She had been aware of him since she landed. He had felt her awareness the way you feel heat from a fire at distance, a directional warmth, sustained and watchful. But she had been performing the political ritual of pretending not to notice him, because acknowledging a figure of uncertain status was a concession she hadn't yet decided to make. When she finally looked, it was with the full weight of her attention, and there was something in her eyes that most people's eyes didn't have. A quality of recognition, not of him specifically, of category. She had met powerful and terrible things before, and whatever sense that experience had developed in her was currently pointing at him like a compass, finding north. "Who are you?" she said, directly, cutting cleanly through Tyrion's sentence without appearing to notice she'd done it. "Someone who wants the same thing you want," Voldemort said. "And what is it you think I want?" "To survive," he paused, "and to win. Those aren't the same thing." "No," he agreed, "they're not. Most people choose incorrectly when forced to pick between them." Something moved across her face. Not softening. She was too disciplined for anything that obvious. But a shift, an adjustment. He had her attention completely now, which was what he had wanted, and her attention was the doorway he needed. He told her the truth about the Night King, not the version he had told Cersei, the strategic briefing, the general's assessment, the carefully edited intelligence. He told Daenerys the real version. He told her the dead army had turned its march specifically because of him. He told her the Night King was coming with more numbers than the living kingdoms could withstand through conventional military engagement. He told her that the only viable counter to an army of the dead was something that operated outside the conventional. Magic powerful enough and strange enough that the Night King's established strategic models didn't account for it. He told her he was that magic, and he watched her decide to trust him, which was not the same as actually trusting him, but which served his purposes equally well. The ritual happened at midnight, 11 days later, in a valley 3 miles north of the city, where Drogon had been stabled in a natural rock enclosure that the dragon had grudgingly accepted. Voldemort had spent those 11 days in careful preparation, rebuilding the Horcrux ritual in his mind for the 43rd time, accounting for every variable, stress testing every assumption. A soul fragment in a dragon would not behave like a soul fragment in a human host. The draconic magical field would interact with it, change it. He did not know precisely how. This was the one genuine uncertainty in a plan that had otherwise been constructed with the obsessive precision that characterized everything he did. He had decided the uncertainty was acceptable. He had been wrong about uncertainties before. He had been catastrophically, fatally wrong about the uncertainty of a boy with a scar. But that had been a failure of intelligence. He had not known about the Elder Wand's true allegiance, had not fully understood the nature of the soul fragment in the boy himself. Here, there was no hidden variable he had failed to account for. There was only the dragon and the dragon's magic, and the question of how they would receive what he was about to place inside them. He reached into himself and he pulled. The sensation of creating a Horcrux was not something language was built to describe. It was the deliberate fracturing of something that was not meant to fracture. A tearing that happened at a level below physical, below even magical, at the foundational level where selfhood and existence were the same thing. He had done it 7 times before. It never became ordinary. It simply became survivable. He pulled a fragment of his soul free with the careful, agonizing precision of a man removing a splinter from his own eye, and he shaped it, and he pressed it into the dark. Drogon screamed. The sound shook the valley walls and sent snow cascading from the surrounding ridges and woke every soldier in King's Landing who had managed to fall asleep. The dragon thrashed against the rock enclosure, not in pain exactly, but in the violent objection of a creature that had never in its life been entered by anything and was experiencing the fundamental wrongness of invasion at a cellular level. Voldemort held the connection steady through sheer force of will, burning more energy in those 40 seconds than he had burned in the entire fight against the White Walkers. Feeling the draconic magical field push back against the soul fragment with a resistance that was not malicious but simply enormous, the way the ocean resists a swimmer, not with intent but with mass. And then something unexpected happened. The resistance inverted. Instead of pushing the fragment out, the draconic field pulled it in, absorbed it, wrapped around it the way water wraps around a stone, dropped into it, completely, instantly, seamlessly. And what emerged on the other side of that absorption was not what Voldemort had calculated. The soul fragment was still his, still recognizably, fundamentally him. But it had changed in the way that things change when they are thoroughly mixed with something much larger and much older than themselves. It had become draconic. It had become fire and magic and the deep, ancient resonance of a creature whose species had been burning the world since before the Valyrian freehold had learned to say their name. He knelt in the snow, breathing carefully, and felt what he had become. Immortal before, yes, but contingently immortal, architecturally immortal, immortal only so long as his Horcruxes survived. Now he was something different. The soul fragment in Drogon was not merely an anchor, it was an integration. It had become part of the dragon's fundamental magical structure, woven into the same deep biology that produced the fire, that sustained the flight, that connected Drogon to the Targaryen bloodline through bonds older than the language used to describe them. To destroy that fragment, you would not merely have to kill the dragon, you would have to unmake what the dragon was. Daenerys found out on a Thursday. She found out because Jon told her. And Jon knew because he had stood close enough to the ritual to feel something wrong happening in it, his own sensitivity to the supernatural, developed through death and resurrection and the accumulated weight of things the living world had put him through. Registering the wrongness of what Voldemort had done to Drogon, the way a healed wound registers a change in weather. He couldn't articulate it precisely. He brought it to Daenerys as a feeling and a fear and the specific, exhausted certainty of a man who had been correct about bad things too many times to dismiss his own instincts. She went to Drogon immediately. The dragon turned to look at her when she approached, and it was Drogon, undeniably, physically, behaviorally Drogon. But there was something in the quality of his attention that she could not name and could not accept. A depth that hadn't been there before. A weight. Now as if something behind those enormous eyes was evaluating her with an intelligence that was not entirely the dragon's own. She reached out and put her hand on the side of his neck, and she felt him breathe, and she stood there for a very long time. When she came back, her face had resolved into something that Tyrion recognized with deep unease as the expression she wore when she had decided on a course of action and was still deciding whether to share it. Or Jon recognized it differently, as grief that had been converted rapidly and out of necessity into purpose. "Can it be undone?" she asked. Tyrion had consulted with Qyburn, who had spent 3 days reviewing everything he had observed of Voldemort's methods. Qyburn's answer had been characteristically precise and characteristically terrible. The soul fragment could not be extracted. It could not be separated from Drogon's magical field without destroying the field entirely. It could not be addressed independently. It was in there now, genuinely and permanently in there, and the only way to remove it was to remove everything it was attached to. "No," Tyrion said, "it can't." Daenerys absorbed this. "And while it's there, while he's in there, Voldemort can't fully die." "Correct. And Drogon would need to be killed. Completely. In a way that destroyed the magical field, not just the body. Qyburn believes dragonfire might do it. The fire of another dragon is sustained at the source, or something that negated magic itself at the point of impact." Tyrion paused. "There may be one other way. If Voldemort's connection to the fragment were severed simultaneously with Drogon's death, if he were destroyed at the exact moment the dragon was, the fragment might not survive either loss." "A simultaneous kill," Jon said. "A coordinated strike, 2 targets, 1 moment. Anything less and he reforms around whatever remains." The 3 of them sat with this information. Arya Stark arrived the following morning from Winterfell, with the look of someone who had been traveling hard and thinking harder, and she brought with her 2 things. A report from the north indicating that the Night King's army had resumed its southward march, with a new urgency that suggested the Night King had, in whatever way the Night King understood situations, he decided that the presence of Voldemort in King's Landing was more immediately threatening than any tactical advantage to be gained by continued preparation, and a question. "Who kills him?" Arya asked. "And who kills the dragon?" The silence that followed was the kind that happens when everyone in a room knows the answer, and no one wants to be the first to say it, because saying it makes it real, and real things have consequences that cannot be taken back. Daenerys answered it. She answered it quietly and without drama, in the manner of someone who had arrived at a conclusion through a process that was now complete and required no further deliberation. She had been raised on the belief that some things were worth more than survival. She had watched people she loved die for the idea that the living deserved to remain that way. Where she had crossed an ocean and lost a child and burned a city and carried the weight of a name that meant either salvation or destruction, depending on who was saying it. And she had arrived here, in this room, in this moment, with this choice, through a road so long and so costly that refusing to walk its final yard would have made everything before it meaningless. "I do," she said, "both." The battle happened at dawn. The details of it were these. Jon Snow engaged Voldemort in the ruins of the Dragon Pit, where the acoustics of the enclosed space and the proximity to the city's foundational stonework created a magical resonance that disrupted Voldemort's ability to draw on the ambient energy he had been accumulating for weeks, a vulnerability that Arya had identified from careful observation and Tyrion had built the entire tactical plan around. Jon was not a wizard. He did not have magic in the formal sense. What he had was the particular unkillable stubbornness of a man who had literally died and come back and had therefore resolved his relationship with mortality in a way that made facing Voldemort qualitatively different from what facing him did to ordinary people. He couldn't kill Voldemort. He knew he couldn't kill Voldemort. He had absolutely no intention of killing Voldemort. He needed to hold him, to occupy his full attention at the precise moment that Daenerys, the sound that Drogon made was not a scream this time. It was something older than sound, something that started in the chest and moved through the bones and arrived in the mind as a color, as a temperature, as the specific quality of loss that only happens when something irreplaceable ends. The dragonfire was white, not the orange-red of ordinary dragonfire. The sustained, focused, resource-directed fire of a dragon whose rider had asked it to burn itself, applied by Rhaegal at Daenerys's precise direction, aimed at the exact point where Qyburn had identified the magical field's densest concentration. Daenerys had not ridden Rhaegal into this. She had stood on the ground and spoken to him in the Valyrian that her family had used to speak to dragons for 4 centuries, and she had asked him for the one thing that no dragon should ever have been asked for. Rhaegal had obeyed, because she was his mother, because she had never asked anything of her children that she was not willing to pay the price for herself. The white fire lasted 4 seconds. At the exact moment the draconic magical field collapsed. At the exact moment the soul fragment lost its anchor, Jon Snow drove the blade of Longclaw through a point in the air, 3 inches above Voldemort's chest where Arya had calculated, based on 3 days of observation, that the wandless dark wizard's concentrated will had a single exploitable point of vulnerability. Not a killing blow, something more specific. A disruption, a deliberate, targeted severing of the connection between Voldemort's consciousness and the distributed network of his living Horcruxes, delivered at the exact moment that the primary anchor was destroyed. The green light that came out of Voldemort had no wand to focus it. It scattered across the ruins of the Dragon Pit in every direction at once, ricocheting off the ancient stone, and it went out like a fire in rain, not with drama, not with fury, not with the thunderous climax that the stories would later assign it when they turned these events into legend, but with the quiet, almost anticlimactic finality of a system whose fundamental logic had been defeated. Lord Voldemort fell. He fell in the way that men who have forgotten what falling feels like always fall, with a kind of surprise, a fractional moment of complete disbelief, the soul-deep impossibility of a man who had built an entire philosophy around the unconquerable nature of his will encountering its absolute limit. He fell, and the stones of the dragon pit received him without ceremony, without acknowledgement, with the supreme indifference that the physical world reserves for those who once believed themselves its master. The silence that followed was enormous. The Iron Throne sat empty for 9 days. No one would touch it. This was not a political choice or a tactical delay. It was something more instinctive, more honest. The throne room had been so thoroughly altered by Voldemort's months of invisible enchantment that the stone itself felt different, and the people who walked through it did so quickly and did not look at the walls too long, and the maesters who were eventually brought in to assess the wards spent 3 days undoing things they could not name with tools they had never needed before. Tyrion handled the political reconstruction with the particular exhausted competence of a man who had been handling political reconstructions his entire life. Arya went home to Winterfell. Jon went north, which was what Jon always did when he survived something and needed to process having survived it. Daenerys stood in the Dragonstone throne room and looked at the ocean for a long time. She was missing something that had been part of her since before she could remember. The bond with Drogon had not merely been affection or partnership. It had been structural, constitutional, woven into the way she understood the world and herself in it. Its absence was not grief exactly. It was the way a person feels after a wound has healed and left no scar, not pain, but the memory of what once occupied the space and the slow, strange work of learning to be whole with a different shape. She would rebuild. She had always rebuilt. It was, she had decided long ago, the most essentially Targaryen thing about her. Not the fire, not the dragons, not the capacity for glory, but the capacity to survive losing the things that made glory possible and choose, again, in the aftermath, to stand up. She stood up. In the deep crypts beneath the Red Keep, in a chamber that the Maesters had not yet reached in their cataloging of Voldemort's enchantments, the silence was complete and cold and very, very old. From the darkness, something moved. Not much. Not loudly. The small, patient movement of something that had been still for a long time and was only now remembering what motion felt like. A sound emerged from the dark. Thin, sibilant, winding through the stone corridors with the particular, unhurried confidence of something that has never once in its existence believed it was finished. It was not a word, not in any language spoken above ground, but in the crypts of the Red Keep, in the cold and the dark and the silence, the sound of it settled into the stone like a second foundation, and something that had no business still existing in a world that believed it destroyed continued, quietly, to wait. The Iron Throne stood empty, and the living celebrated a victory they had genuinely earned. Voldemort's visible architecture was dismantled, his compulsions unwound, his ravens corrected, his enchantments laboriously unpicked from the walls of the Red Keep by men who did not fully understand what they were touching. The noble families who had carried his soul fragments reported in the weeks that followed a sudden clarity, as if a sound they'd grown so accustomed to they'd stopped hearing it had finally ceased. The Stark boy stopped dreaming in serpent tongues. The Lannister child's headaches ended. The living kingdoms exhaled collectively. For the first time in months, they had survived 2 dead kings. They had survived a winter that carried something worse than cold inside it. They had survived the arrival of a power that made the Iron Throne itself look like a local disagreement. And in the silence of their survival, with the dragons reduced to Rhaegal circling alone over a sea that no longer reflected green fire, the world of Westeros began, carefully, incompletely, with the particular fragility of things rebuilt after catastrophe, to move forward. What waited in the dark beneath the Red Keep had patience that made kingdoms look like afternoons. It had survived death before. It had survived it 7 times. It had plans that did not require urgency, only time. And in a world where winter came and went, and kings rose and fell, and the wheel turned with or without anyone's permission, time was the one resource that could not be taken away. The serpent did not hiss again for a very long time, but it did not sleep. May the Force be with you. More stories await.